And thank you for the Poughkeepsie Public Library for the invitation to speak to you this evening. And in particular, I really want to thank Shannon Butler for arranging this talk. I know this is a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, so thank you so much. So, how did people think about homosexuality in revolutionary America? What did they think about it? These are seemingly simple questions, but are actually really difficult for us to answer. Over the last 60 years, historians have detailed the diversity of our nation's founders. We know how issues of race, gender, religion, even class intersected with the American Revolution, but we don't know much about the role that LGBTQ plus people played in the creation of the United States. Now, part of the problem is the evolving notion of sexual identity. While people of the same sex have always had sex, the understanding of such intimacies has changed considerably over time. For example, the term homosexual was not coined until the 1860s, nearly a century after the Revolution. Conversely, while terms like sodomy and buggery did exist in the 18th century, they often referred to acts rather than people. Another problem is we have very limited sources. Unlike later eras, there are only scraps of evidence to understand same-sex sexuality in the 18th century. For the era of the American Revolution, probably the best example of someone we believe was involved in same-sex intimacy is Baron von Steuben, the Prussian officer who joined the War for Independence on the side of the Americans and taught the Continental soldiers how to march. One of the reasons why von Steuben had come to America, in addition to his appreciation for liberty, of course, was that he had taken familiarities with young boys and was forced to flee his homeland. Now, examples like von Steuben are very curt. We don't have a lot of evidence on him. We know very little about how people in revolutionary America thought about people like von Steuben or homosexuality in general. And we really don't have any evidence of how the people thought about themselves. Moreover, these examples offer very little insight into how the War for Independence affected or was affected by their sexuality. By contrast, the more we've studied African Americans, women, and other marginalized groups, the more we've come to appreciate how independence radicalized these groups and laid the foundations for a more inclusive notion of citizenship. Calls for freedom among the enslaved gave rise to abolitionism, while the insistence that the founders remember the ladies led to the campaign for women's suffrage. Might the revolution have had a radical effect upon men who had sex with men? And if so, is there a legacy of this inclusion? About 15 years ago, I found a story that I believed allowed me to answer some of these questions. In the summer of 2011, I was researching the American Revolution at the William L. Clements Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The Clements Library, with no disrespect to the Poughkeepsie Public Library, but the Clements Library is one of the great repositories of early American history, with an exceptional collection of papers relating to the British Army on the eve of the Revolution. In particular, the Clements contains the papers of the man we see here, General Thomas Gage, who served as commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America from 1763 to 1775. Gage was an exceptional bureaucrat, and he preserved all manner of letters and materials for the British government. Among the manuscripts in the Gage papers, I discovered a 26-page trial transcript of the case of Robert Newburgh, a British Army officer who was accused of buggery. I skimmed the transcript, but as it was filled with names and incidents that I couldn't make sense of, I set it aside. It wasn't until I finished another book, Quarters, that I returned to the Clements and the curious transcript to see if I might make sense of this trial. I discovered that the transcript in Ann Arbor was but one of several legal actions involving Robert Newburgh, and I discovered 6 more cases at the UK National Archives at Kew in London. Unlike nearly every other source from the era, these transcripts and their supporting documents are dripping with details. We actually get to hear what people thought about men who had sex with men, and we have an opportunity to think about how a man accused of same-sex intimacy negotiated this world. Moreover, the trials took place in Philadelphia and New York City less than a year before the Revolutionary War began, and several of the men involved in the trials fought in the War for Independence. More importantly, the rhetoric and ideology of the revolution seeps through the testimony. The enemies of Robert Newburgh feared that his buggery threatened to bring down the British Empire, while Newburgh and his defenders utilized a language of rights and equality that was much closer to the words of the American founders than the British Army. Vicious and Immoral, Homosexuality, the American Revolution, and the Trials of Robert Newburgh is the result of my investigation. So in my talk this evening, I want to give an overview of the book and discuss what the trials of Robert Newburgh might be able to tell us about homosexuality and the American Revolution. I believe that these cases can help us to understand how people thought about homosexuality in the American Revolution and what they thought about it. Now, I want to warn you that the trials of Robert Newburgh are an imperfect data set. They only cover a small number of people in a short period of time. These documents only discuss male-male intimacy, and there's no concern for lesbianism, bisexuality, or transgenderism. Although women and African Americans appear occasionally, nearly every voice recorded is white and male. I also don't have images of the principal people involved in these trials, which I want to acknowledge before I start showing you pictures and have you think I'm showing you actual events that took place. I'll be using images from the National Army Museum in London and the Library of Congress here in the United States. And I think they will illustrate some of the era and some of perhaps what's going on or would have been going on. Despite these limitations, I believe that Newburgh's trials clearly indicate that homosexuality was widely understood in the era of the Revolution in ways not that dissimilar from our own, and that through his arguments, Robert Newburgh laid out better than anyone else the case for sexual liberalism in the nation that followed. Now, to understand the trials of Robert Newburgh, we have to start with the man himself. And again, I don't have a picture of him, which I really wish I did. Robert Newburgh was born in 1742 near Dublin, Ireland. His parents were Protestants, and they descended from the English planters who had remade the island into an English colony. Robert grew up with the privileges of an elite background. He was skilled at horse riding, he spoke Latin, and he studied with a private tutor. At 16, he entered Trinity College and took his bachelor's degree 4 years later. Upon completing his education, Robert Newburgh became a priest. He had been raised in the Anglican tradition, and he took holy orders in the Church of Ireland, which was a Protestant denomination that was the Irish branch of the Church of England. Upon ordination, Robert Newburgh became a traveling parson, serving in several curacies or temporary appointments across Ireland. 3 years later, he entered the British Army as a chaplain. He purchased a commission in the 18th Regiment of Foot, which was also known as the Royal Irish Regiment. In May 1773, Robert Newburgh made his way to Cork on the southern coast of Ireland, seeking passage to America. The 18th Regiment at this point was stationed in Philadelphia, and the regiment's colonel was insistent that Robert Newburgh join his unit as soon as possible. The unit had been without a chaplain for quite a long time. However, before he could depart, Robert Newburgh received a most disquieting letter. "I am unfortunately acquainted with some parts of your character," the letter began, "which render you a very improper person to act as chaplain to a regiment I highly honor." According to the letter, several former and current British Army officers had testified that Newburgh was guilty of a most horrid and unnatural crime, particularly with your own manservant, whom you slept with. The man that wrote the letter was Thomas Batt, who had formerly been a captain in the 18th Regiment. Batt had recently retired from the British Army and was in Ireland procuring wares for a wine shop that he would later open in Philadelphia. While in Ireland, Thomas Batt heard rumors about Robert Newburgh's sexual relations with his servant. In Batt's opinion, Newburgh's actions disqualified him from the army. So what was Robert Newburgh accused of doing? According to one testimony, when Robert Newburgh was a traveling parson, he rented a room in the Irish town of Sligo. He brought a valet with him, and a separate bed was placed in his chambers for his servant boy. However, the landlady did notice and remark that the said pallet bed was unspoiled. In other words, the servant's bed was undisturbed. It hadn't been slept in. This meant that the two men had obviously slept together. Now, to be sure, it was not unusual in the 18th century for two men to share a bed. But those who saw Newburgh and his servant interact reported that the boy was very free with the priest, much more so than was typical of a master-servant relationship. One observer noted that the two men quarreled like an old married couple, and that Newburgh always kept his own servant remarkably neat. The story of Newburgh and his servant spread across Ireland and remained a topic of gossip 4 years later. In fact, Thomas Batt did not seek out this story. Rather, it came to him over casual conversation. A short time before Batt had left the regiment, he was in the company of a number of gentlemen who asked if he knew the new chaplain who had been appointed to the 18th Regiment. When Batt replied that he did not, they then laughed at me a good deal, and said I soon should know him, for that the first opportunity he would be into my beef. In short, many told me he was a notorious buggerer. Now, this story troubled Thomas Batt, so he investigated the rumors, and soon he found that he could corroborate them. In Cork, Batt met a ship's captain who was about to sail for America. Now, Robert Newburgh had also sought passage to America on this very same ship, but the captain had refused to carry him to Philadelphia. As the captain told Batt, if he took Mr. Newburgh to sea with him, that Mr. Newburgh would cruise up his gut. Now, the language used here to describe the chaplain's sexual activities is very revealing. Gut is certainly a euphemism for rectum, while beef refers to the stocky part of a man's body, such as his backside. Historians have argued that in the 18th century, sodomy was a confused category that encompassed a variety of acts. But Thomas Batt spoke specifically of intercourse in his account of Newburgh's sexual activities. He also perceived this priest to be an active partner in intercourse, which is not surprising given that Newburgh's supposed lover was his servant. Perhaps most revealing, Batt thought that Newburgh's actions were not confined to one man. Rather, he lusted to penetrate any man, even him. For it was not what Newburgh had done that concerned Thomas Batt, it was what he might do in the future. When Thomas Batt named Robert Newburgh a notorious buggerer, he was not describing acts, but a rudimentary sexual identity. Now, Robert Newburgh was mortified by Thomas Batt's claims. In subsequent testimony, he admitted that he had, in fact, slept with his servant in Sligo. But this was innocent, Robert Newburgh insisted. He had grown up with the servant, and the two men had frequently slept together because Robert Newburgh was often ill. Now, such an explanation did little to calm the fears that Thomas Batt had raised. In the 18th century, homoerotic desire was often believed to be the result of a nervous condition, such that Newburgh's admission of illness only confirmed his penchant for buggery. In June of 1773, Robert Newburgh departed for America. His chronic illness impeded his travels, such that he did not reach Philadelphia until September of 1773. Thomas Batt was also headed to America, and he preceded Newburgh by a month, meaning that by the time Robert Newburgh made it to Philadelphia, everyone in the regiment had heard the story of how he had had sex with his servant. In the fall of 1773, Robert Newburgh began his duties as chaplain to the 18th Regiment. He delivered Sunday sermons, he celebrated the Eucharist, and he read funeral services for soldiers who had died. Despite the rumors, most of the Royal Irish treated Newburgh with respect. Newburgh even became close friends with two officers in the regiment, Lieutenant Alexander Fowler and Ensign Nicholas Trist. Nicholas Trist later testified that they have a club among themselves on every Monday night, at which they talked about religion, science, and history. But not everyone was pleased to have a reputed buggerer in his midst. Perhaps no member of the 18th Regiment proved a greater nemesis to Robert Newburgh than Captain Benjamin Chapman. Chapman was also an Irish Protestant, but he was a career officer. He harbored ambitions for promotion, and he took a hard line against anyone who threatened the reputation of the British Army. Once Chapman heard the story that Newburgh had had sex with his servant, he carefully observed the priest until he found proof that Robert Newburgh was indeed a buggerer. In November of 1773, Captain Benjamin Chapman was out walking with the secretary to the governor of New York. As Chapman and the other man talked, the Reverend Mr. Newburgh galloped close by them in a most unbecoming dress. Newburgh was on horseback, and his appearance so startled the colonial official that he asked if he knew whose groom that was. When Captain Chapman explained that it was the regiment's chaplain, the official replied that he was sorry to see it, for that he looked more like a fashionable groom or jockey than one of that sacred function. The incident of seeing Newburgh on the horse so embarrassed Chapman that he vowed to never take any notice of Newburgh unless unavoidably compelled to it. As a priest, Robert Newburgh was expected to wear drab clothes, and many Anglican clergymen wore black cassocks. But on horseback, Newburgh wore a long coat with a red collar, Chapman testified. Nor was this inappropriate attire confined to horse riding. In Philadelphia, Robert Newburgh wore a light-colored coat, leather knickers, and white silk stockings. Such clothes were popular among the elites of the 1770s, but in Chapman's opinion, they made Robert Newburgh look like what is now termed a macaroni. Now, this term macaroni appears only once in Robert Newburgh's trials, but it is perhaps the most revealing. And macaroni, as we know, is a type of food, and that's where the term started in the 1770s. But by around this time, it had become a term of derision for men deemed inappropriately masculine. A macaroni could be identified by his clothes and his deportment, which were ridiculously ostentatious. The archetypal macaroni wore spotted or striped clothes, ridiculous wigs, and carried a snuff box. A macaroni's effeminacy was a window into his character, which most agreed was despicable. An English author writing that same year deplored fribbling hairdressers, boring orators, and London gadabouts as monkey-ronies, claiming that luxury had deprived them of their masculinity. Although few connected Macaroni's appearance to sexual desire, some speculated that his effeminacy was predictive of buggery. One caricaturist labeled a macaroni Ganymede, Jupiter's mythical boy lover, and showed him facing the hangman for his crimes. This was how Captain Benjamin Chapman saw Robert Newburgh. His flamboyant attire in the macaroni style was proof that he desired sex with other men. Captain Chapman was not the only officer, rather, to take note of Newburgh's appearance, or to worry that his desires might harm the regiment. When Robert Newburgh purchased a new green coat, a captain remarked that the parson is a buggerer, and everyone around him laughed. Other officers began to worry about Newburgh's intentions among the soldiers. A captain ordered his men to stay away from Newburgh, while the quartermaster fretted when Newburgh requested a room near the outhouse, because this was a site notorious for male-male sexual trysts. It appears that Robert Newburgh did not seek out sexual partners once he reached America. Certainly the servant he had slept with did not accompany him into the army. Yet this did not soften the opinions of his enemies. It was not what Newburgh had done, but who he was. In his initial accusation, Thomas Batt took note of Newburgh's character, and this term resurfaced constantly in the assessments of him. Character was synonymous with reputation, but it also had an inner quality that could not be disguised. As Captain Chapman and others observed Newburgh's appearance and actions, they sought to determine whether his very soul was corrupt. Sexual activity was but a manifestation of a man's corrupt character, such that Chapman and Batt could not forgive actions that occurred before Newburgh joined the army. It was not what he had done that disturbed them, but who he was. Now, historians have argued that in the 18th century, a man's sexual acts were not necessarily predictive of his identity. For example, in colonial America, a man accused of sodomizing another man might often be whipped or fined, but most of the time it was not assumed that his character was such that he would do it again. The case of Robert Newburgh suggests that this was not true any longer in 1773. It was not just that Robert Newburgh had committed buggery that aroused concern. It was the fear that his character was corrupt. In other words, that he was a buggerer. The term buggerer, which is a strange one certainly, derives from the term bogomil, which was the name of a 10th century religious sect that was deemed heretical and suspected of sexual depravity, specifically sodomy and buggery. By the 18th century, however, buggerer was more than a description of a man who committed buggery. A buggerer had a specific character, and this truth could be observed through clothes and actions. Buggerers were dangerous. They were immoral, and they threatened the divine order. They failed to marry and fathered children, preying on inferior men instead. They tempted others into depravity, not necessarily for sex, but as pawns that they could manipulate to ruin society. To be sure, a buggerer was not the same thing as a homosexual, but there were strong parallels between the two. Robert Newburgh had to respond to the charges against him. Once Captain Benjamin Chapman shunned him, no enlisted man in the regiment would go to him for spiritual guidance. Robert Newburgh was a devout Christian who believed it was his duty to help the less fortunate. But without the respect of the soldiers, Robert Newburgh could not do his job. As Newburgh began to complain about the situation, his commanding officer offered him leave to go home. Because the rumors of what he had done were confined to Ireland, the CO reasoned, Newburgh should return home and clear up his reputation there. But Newburgh rejected this offer. If he left America and went back to Ireland, he would effectively forfeit his commission and be bereft of a livelihood. So he stayed and fought for his reputation. He insisted that he was not a buggerer. Now, in the 18th century, many men who were accused of buggery slunk away. The 18th century was an era of scandal, and the British press was filled with stories of men of the highest rank driven into exile by their base desires. But Robert Newburgh did not slink away. He had to silence the rumors that he was a buggerer in order to retain his position. But this was an uphill battle. Nearly everyone thought he was a buggerer. And at some point, he conceded this and acted accordingly. Newburgh began by filing civil suits against his accusers. He sued Thomas Batt in the Court of Common Pleas for Philadelphia County. He then filed a case against the captain who had said the parson is a buggerer. He also demanded the quartermaster be court-martialed for insinuating that his choice of rooms was motivated by prurient desire. But none of these cases silenced the consensus that Robert Newburgh was a buggerer. If anything, it confirmed what everybody thought, because now he was seen as a troublemaker who did not belong in the British Army. Accordingly, in the summer of 1774, Robert Newburgh demanded a court-martial to clear his name once and for all. In June, Robert Newburgh convinced a soldier to formally accuse him of buggery. In charges filed with the deputy judge advocate, Private Robert Jeff claimed that because Newburgh was known to have committed buggery, I think it improper in me as a private soldier to pay him any compliment or to call upon him to discharge his duty. With the formal accusation of a sexual crime, the army had to act. It had to organize a general court-martial to decide on Robert Newburgh's character. In August 1774, 24 members of the 18th Regiment left Philadelphia and marched to New York City to see their chaplain court-martialed. Robert Newburgh stood accused of vicious and immoral behavior, which broke down into charges of perjury, scandalous and indecent acts, and conduct derogatory from the sacred character with which he is invested. Serving as prosecutor for the army was Captain Benjamin Chapman, the man who had seen Newburgh on a horse and the man whose sour opinion of the chaplain had not improved any in the last 8 months. Officers from other regiments served as a jury, and Robert Newburgh had to act as his own defense attorney. Now, the charges against Newburgh were serious. If convicted, Newburgh would be cashiered, that is, he would be expelled from the British Army with no recompense for his commission. As he began his case, Captain Chapman announced that the army would not be prosecuting Newburgh for sodomy. Robert Jeff, the soldier who accused Mr. Newburgh of sodomy, had since deserted, Chapman told the court. Now, although Chapman dispensed with acts of buggery, he nevertheless proceeded to prosecute Newburgh as a buggerer. It had never been about acts for Chapman. Rather, it was the priest's character that made him unfit for the army. Chapman thus proceeded to introduce instances where Newburgh had acted disrespectfully toward his superiors, defied military hierarchy, and borne false witness at previous trials. The heart of the Army's case against Robert Newburgh was his relationship with a private soldier. On the third day of the trial, Captain Chapman called Private Nicholas Gaffney and proceeded to elicit from him a tale of how Robert Newburgh had seduced him. In so doing, he used Robert Newburgh's reputation as a buggerer to argue that he had manipulated an innocent soldier to bring disorder to the regiment. Nicholas Gaffney was a longtime member of the Royal Irish Regiment, but he had grown disgruntled with the service. The year before, he had accused his captain of corruption and demanded that he be tried. However, Gaffney was unable to substantiate the charges, and so he subsequently found himself court-martialed. The idea of an enlisted man questioning the character of an officer offended many in the regiment. It indicated that military hierarchy was being challenged from below. As colonists in Philadelphia and New York became increasingly vocal in their questioning of monarchy and imperial rule, such instability within the British Army was deemed particularly troubling. Now, during his trials, Private Gaffney had received legal advice from Robert Newburgh. This was initially kept secret from officers in the regiment, but when the chaplain's involvement was discovered, the officers concluded that Gaffney would not have carried matters to those violent lengths had he not been assisted privately by some miscreant. For many in the regiment, Robert Newburgh's assistance of Private Gaffney proved that the chaplain did not care about the social order, and was further proof of his character as a buggerer. At Newburgh's court-martial, Private Gaffney was the Army's star witness. Captain Chapman called him and elicited a testimony that described the two men's relationship as entirely inappropriate. According to Gaffney, Newburgh arranged to meet him in his private chambers. "Did Mr. Newburgh and he ever drink together?" Chapman asked. "Yes, frequently," Gaffney replied. Private Gaffney also testified that Robert Newburgh had given him a snuff box, a feminine article that many associated with macaronis, and that Newburgh had told lewd stories in his presence. Gaffney also claimed that at times Robert Newburgh and he had been alone together after dark. "He has gone there at 10 o'clock at night when Mr. Newburgh has been in bed," Gaffney told the court. Newburgh, upon seeing him, put on his morning gown and went into the closet to him. Not only had Newburgh and Gaffney been alone together in a bedroom at night, Newburgh had been in a state of undress. Through his questions, Captain Chapman followed the tropes of the popular novels of the era to argue that the priest had seduced the private. Newburgh invited Gaffney into his private chambers, plied him with alcohol, gifts, and flattery. Gaffney was innocent, simple, and trusting, while Newburgh was elite, educated, and manipulative. Everyone knew that Newburgh had slept with the servant, and Chapman used this rumor to suggest that he had similar designs on Gaffney. Now, to be sure, Captain Chapman never insinuated that Newburgh and Gaffney had had sex. But a buggerer's disregard for the natural order was not confined to the physical. Instead of seducing Gaffney into bed, Newburgh persuaded him to charge his superiors in order to undermine military hierarchy. Newburgh hated the 18th Regiment, Captain Chapman insisted, and Gaffney was merely a pawn of his design. Once Captain Chapman concluded his case, it was up to Robert Newburgh to offer a defense. Newburgh questioned the facts of the Army's stellar character, he could not be a buggerer. The sanguine opinions of Fowler and Trist toward Newburgh stemmed from their own characters. Both men stood apart from the rest of the officers. Fowler was disabled, and Trist was older. They also disliked Captain Benjamin Chapman and believed his persecution of Newburgh was an instance of petty tyranny. Fowler and Trist also differed from the other officers in that both of them were married. However, Nicholas Trist's marriage had raised questions about his own loyalty. When Nicholas Trist wed a daughter of a Philadelphia innkeeper, the commanding officer speculated that he intends becoming a patriotic American, as the anti-British sentiments of his new in-laws were well known throughout the colonies. To be sure, neither Fowler nor Trist were tolerant of buggerers. Like other officers, they had heard stories of Newburgh's sleeping arrangements, and both men treated him with skepticism when they first met. But as they got to know Newburgh, the two became impressed with his character. Whatever may or may not have happened in Ireland was of no concern to them, because Newburgh had proven himself to be an upstanding priest and a good friend. Accordingly, they ignored the rumors of buggery. Whether or not they were true were in so doing, he came dangerously close to mouthing the same words as the men who would declare independence less than 2 years later. Newburgh began his closing argument by dismissing charges of perjury and falsehood as mere misunderstandings. He then refuted Private Gaffney's claim that he had seduced him into making unfounded claims against his captain. Newburgh insisted that his assistance of Gaffney was motivated by Christian charity and not sexual desire. I had always been taught that men, by nature, were entitled to equal rights, and that it was my duty as a gentleman and a Christian to afford relief to distress, whether I found it in a lord or a beggar, an officer or a soldier, Newburgh told the court. I confess, deceived and disappointed. But as he was chaplain to the regiment, it was his duty to help the less fortunate. Newburgh also had to address the claims about his appearance. While Captain Benjamin Chapman had asserted that he looked like a macaroni, Newburgh asked why this even mattered. What a clergyman wore had been the subject of bitter debate in medieval times, but from the little acquaintance I had gained with the world in this age, I imagined all those old prejudices were exploded, and that man and ministers were judged of more by their principles and doctrines than their dress. So long as a man did good work, it did not matter what he looked like. Throughout his defense and closing arguments, Robert Newburgh never argued that a man had the right to be a buggerer, or that what a person did in bed was irrelevant. Nevertheless, his rhetoric anticipated the sexual liberalism of a later age. His mention of equal rights in reference to Gaffney suggests that he believed there was a place for all men in society, not just the high and mighty. Likewise, his dismissal of old prejudices indicates he believed himself to be in a more enlightened age, where a man's appearance was irrelevant. He made all of these claims while standing accused of being a buggerer. Perhaps Robert Newburgh understood the connection. Certainly his accusers did. Now, I won't tell you how the court-martial ended because I want you to either buy the book or go to the Poughkeepsie Public Library and check it out. But rest assured, there's a lot more homosexuality, revolution, and trials of Robert Newburgh than I can cover here tonight. However, I don't want to end my talk without drawing some larger conclusions from this case. I think that the trials of Robert Newburgh offer some answers to the questions of how people thought about homosexuality in revolutionary America and what they thought about it. On the one hand, the trials confirm our worst suspicions of the past as overflowing with hatred and homophobia. Thomas Batt thought that a rumor of buggery was sufficient for Robert Newburgh to lose his position, while Captain Benjamin Chapman thought cited Newburgh's appearance as proof of his sexual desire. And this revulsion was felt widely. The most sympathetic responses came from Lieutenant Fowler and Ensign Trist, who just wanted to ignore all the unpleasant things being said about their friend. On the other hand, there are things and there are parts of these trials that subvert such a pessimistic view of the past. Newburgh's response to the accusations against him is certainly one of the most surprising. He faced his accusers openly, even though such actions only confirmed suspicions about his character. He also spoke of rights and equality at a time when such talk was deeply suspect in the British Army. The loyalty of Fowler and Trist is also remarkable. They knew the rumors about Newburgh's sexual activities, but defended him anyway. I think that this dichotomy is completely reflective of homosexuality in the era of the American Revolution. Male-male intimacy was a controversial topic, and different people had different opinions. Some thought that buggerers should be put to death. Others laughed at them. Some ignored them, and others wondered if society might not be more tolerant. This difference of opinion is not wholly foreign from our own time, such that I think 18th century views of homosexuality were more similar to the 21st century than we may think. The trials of Robert Newburgh also offer a new way to think about the American Revolution. I find it interesting how the officers' opinions of Newburgh correlated to the impending division between Britain and its colonies. A month after Newburgh's court-martial ended, several members of the 18th Regiment were deployed to Massachusetts, and many of them took part in the battles of Lexington and Concord. As the war proceeded, the men who had been the most determined to evict Newburgh from the British Army led the charge to prevent American independence. Both Thomas Batt and Benjamin Chapman remained loyal to King George III as they sought to defend the British Empire from disintegration. By contrast, Newburgh's staunchest defenders left the British Army and became citizens of the United States. Alexander Fowler worked for the Continental Congress during the war and later became a merchant in Pittsburgh. Nicholas Trist moved to Louisiana and began a plantation near Manchac. Both men were patriots. Fowler ran for Congress as a member of Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, while Nicholas Trist's wife Elizabeth was buried in an unmarked grave in Monticello when she died. This divergence of loyalty matched opinions of homosexuality. The opinions of Batt and Chapman reflected a British approach, one steeped in scandal that connected a man's personal character to the fate of the empire. In such a worldview, a buggerer was a cause of disorder, and he had to be rooted out lest he pull down that natural order. By contrast, Fowler and Trist exhibited a more laissez-faire attitude. They could ignore men who had sex with men. A buggerer was less of a threat to the social order than an exacting captain or a British king. This correlation is the true legacy of the trials of Robert Newburgh for us today. The men who found themselves at odds with the British Army, with its persecution of Robert Newburgh, helped to found a new nation. For them, buggery was something that did not disqualify a man from his position, and by extension did not prohibit one from citizenship. Historians have argued that because the ideology of the American Revolution contained the commitment to individual rights and liberty, that the nation that followed always contained the seeds of abolitionism, feminism, and social equality. For this reason, we should not be so quick to dismiss the revolutionary potential of Newburgh's trials. Perhaps as with race and gender, we can appreciate the potential for inclusion for LGBTQ plus people and how it was inherent in the creation of the United States, even if the full equality was delayed by 2 centuries. Thank you.
That was incredibly fascinating. Thank you so much, Professor McCurdy. I want people to be able to ask questions. Is that okay?
Sure, of course. I'm happy to answer.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to either unmute yourselves or type your questions in the chat, and I could read them. Does anyone have a question?
Yeah, I was going to jump in. Sorry, I came in a little bit late because I was doing something earlier. So, John, I guess as far as Robert Newburgh and what's it called? And just I think you were also talking about the American Revolution too. Was Robert Newburgh I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. What do you think Robert Newburgh was able to really discover about, the American Revolution in general, John?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think, and so in my argument, right? Of course, I'm offering an argument. Others might see it differently, but the one piece of my argument where it falls apart is Robert Newburgh himself, right? So Robert Newburgh never leaves the British Army, or not. I mean, or the British. He never ceases to be a British subject. He remains loyal to the king until the end, through the end of his life. Although although his friends, people who had supported him in the army, they leave and become American citizens. Robert Newburgh remains a loyal British subject in the army through much of the Revolution, and will later retire back to the British Isles.
Interesting. Thank you.
I got a question for you. You keep stating how Robert Newburgh had enemies, right?
Yeah.
He was commissioned, right? He was a commissioned officer.
Right.
So I would imagine that it would probably be easier for a non-commissioned soldier to have lived out a life in this matter, this a sort of a homosexual life. Is it true to say that maybe because he had this commission, because he had a little bit more people watching his every move, that it would be harder for him to live out the life that maybe he wanted to live? Uh-oh, did I freeze or did you freeze?
Until it takes a little while for it to go from the accusation to the court-martial. And during this time, various leaders, General Gage, for example, says, "Can't we just make this all go away? This is, charging a man with this type of crime. We can't prove it. It's all hearsay. It's only going to lead to divisions in the regiment. It's only going to make everyone angry. It's only going to make everything worse. Can't we just make this go away?" And so, I think this is sort of reflective of how a lot of people would want to see this as, if two men are doing something and they're not disturbing anybody else, if everyone's a willing partner, and they're keeping to themselves, the British Army's not terribly interested in digging into it, right, as it were. But yeah, Newburgh is a high profile character. It's hard for people to ignore him because he is a chaplain, because he is an officer. And I think there's also something a little, queer probably about chaplains in general, right? These are men connected to the army who aren't soldiers. They're not fighting. They don't carry a gun. They're there to provide support and comfort and in things that would not be seen as terribly masculine. And so, yeah, so I think that's it's harder for Newburgh to get away with it. It's also, again, he had several opportunities to just leave. He could gone back to Ireland. The whole thing would have gone away. None of this would have ended up in the record. But he's like, no. I want to make a stink of this thing.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions to add? I guess not. Nobody no slow typers out there. I hate ending it before somebody finally gets the chance to say what they want to say. Okay. Well, I think that was really, really interesting. Again, folks, the book Vicious and Immoral, here at the local library. There's actually quite a few copies in the Mid-Hudson library system. So if you can't get it from us, you can certainly get it from one of our other local libraries. But we've got it here. It's been hiding in my office. I'm going to put it back on the shelf, though. I promise, because I know somebody's going to go and put it on hold right now, because it's a really, really interesting read. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us for our Revolutionary War series here. It's very cool.
Well, of course. And thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. All right, folks. Thanks once again, everybody, for attending another local history discussion. And we'll see you next time.